let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Theo.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Singapore and Happy New Year to all of you. So if we look into a human-to-machine interaction, such as when operator wants to access a service like a database, we see a typical access workflow that looks like the following. Right? The operator needs to log into a VPN server, followed by a bastion host, using credentials provided to him. He needs to know the location of the target system, so the IP address and port that he can connect to. And he has to know the database username, password, enter those credentials so he can perform some work. So while this looks normal to most of us, this workflow has few challenges. From the administrator perspective, onboarding is complex. There are many things you need to consider, such as creating credentials for all of these systems that are involved, distributing these credentials, and rotating them. This workflow also brings users onto a private network. It has disadvantages that users are exposed to, and they can potentially access other things inside that private network. And also, nowadays, administrators need to support infrastructure that is very dynamic. In that environment, applications often move to different nodes. They have different IP addresses. You may have auto-scaling where new nodes get added or redeployed. So administrators need to make sure that users have access to these new targets, enforce policies, for example, by rewriting firewall rules despite all these changes. And from the end user's perspective, there is a cognitive load on their side. They need to remember these credentials. They need to store them in a secure location. And normally users don't do that. Instead, they put credential in the most convenient place, such as notepads on their laptop, text files, emails. And these basically create additional exposure and risk to organizations. So Boundary basically is a secure access management from users to the target service. And it's focusing on the human-to-machine interactions. Boundary streamlines the access workflow by regulating and brokering access without ever needing users to be on the network. There are several things that Boundary provides and their advantages. So one is support for existing identity provider, such as Active Directory, Okta, Auth0, including HashiCorp Vault. So the latest iterations of Vault, which is version 1.9, supports Vault as an OIDC provider. Right? So basically, user authenticates to Boundary through one of these trusted form of identity, and the advantage is onboarding and offboarding is simplified. There's no need to distribute new sets of credentials. You simply add new users to your identity provider or remove users from them. Boundary also provides catalog of hosts and services that users have access to. So the advantage here is users don't need to be exposed to internal addresses and the network remains private. So in other words, the security policy follows the user regardless of where they are without ever needing them to be on the network. Boundary introduces dynamic host catalog. So basically, this allows administrators to automate the discovery and do permission enforcement of new target systems. And they can do this by specifying criteria, we call them filters, that match resource providers. The advantage here is the administrators don't have to worry about changing controls all the time to keep pace. Boundary makes use of just-in-time credential store. So users do not need to remember and store username passwords. Credentials will be given to them. In this case, Boundary will leverage Vault to provide just-in-time credentials. So that means when possible, Boundary gives users unique credentials just for the session. It is time-bounded, and at the end of the session, these credentials will be revoked and cleaned up instead of managing long-lived credentials. So let's go through these boundary systems in order to understand how users can reach the target. First, they need to authenticate to boundary controller. So boundary controller is where your administrator configure who you in your organization is allowed to access what systems and services. So this is a very much a policy-driven approach, right? All of those controller configurations and data, such as the users under management, access under management, are captured in a Postgres database. There is another important component, which is a boundary worker. Basically, it proxies the connection to the target system, and we'll talk about it more shortly. But the essence here, you can have multiple controllers and multiple boundary workers to provide scaling. They can even be on the different locations. They can be deployed on various target platforms, on-premise, and as well as different cloud providers. As I mentioned, you can have multiple boundary controllers. The thing here is that controllers do not have a leader, right? And the connections between the client, the controller, and the worker are protected via single-use MTL stack. Let's talk about the boundary worker. Basically, it proxies TCP traffic. Therefore, it supports all kinds of targets and applications without requiring you to install any agents. There can be multiple of them in multiple locations. And ideally, you want to put certain workers so that they have access to certain networks. And you assign users to boundary worker that is closest to the target. And when users is connecting to a target, then boundary worker opens up a listening port through which users can make an authenticated session. So the worker will ask the controller for authorization, and upon checking, the controller gives back that authorization. And at the same time, controller is going to ask credential store to retrieve users' credentials. Boundary, in this case, makes use of Vault as a just-in-time credential store. And what that means is Boundary can check out secrets from Vault credentials library and then presents that to the users. This credential is time-bounded whenever possible. Boundary is going to give the users a unique credential just specifically for that session. And then it will seamlessly inject these credentials into the user session. And once that's done, the user is connected to the target system, which is the red line running all the way from the client to the target system. So I have a demo environment. So I want to show you a few things here. I have a boundary server that is running on my laptop. I also have Vault on my laptop. And I have a set of targets on different locations. I put up the code to create this environment on my GitHub account so you can duplicate what I have. Right. So first, let's take a look into the boundary web admin console. So this is the console that is going to use for administrator to manage boundary. All right, so as an administrator, I can log into Boundary via several authentication methods. OIDC is provided, and as you can see, there are several of them here, and as well as the typical username password authentication method that is managed locally by the Boundary. So I'm going to use Vault as an OIDC provider, which means here that Boundary delegate the authentication to Vault. I'm going to log in as myself. And once I'm successfully authenticated, I log in back into the Boundary and can manage all the resources. These resources are basically put in a hierarchical fashion, starting what we call scope with the organizations with a global at the top, and underneath that global, you have several organizations, including the HashiCorp Singapore. And if I drill down into it, I have a couple projects that are for production support and for the Northwind ERP project. So basically, this project holds the target systems. And there are quite a few targets that are already configured, a Windows workstation, a couple of databases, and a couple of Unix servers. Let me show you how to create a new target. And that's simply by clicking that new button there. A target is basically represents a service that you want to connect to. So here I'm going to connect to the SSH, which is the default port is 22. And I can control the access to this target by, there are two controls that I can do that. And I can modify the maximum durations of the sessions. By default, it is 8 hours. Here, I'm going to use 150 seconds to 20 seconds. And the other control is the maximum number of connections. And by default, that is 1, just to make the each session is unique. But there are scenarios such as when you connect to a database when you need to have multiple connections per session. So this service is actually running on a set of hosts. I have a host sets. Most of them are static, but also have a dynamic host catalog. So basically, this enables me to discover newly running instances on EC2 in a certain region that have tag, certain tags. And in my case, it is the tag name is project, and the value is a boundary demo. So anything that fulfill that criteria will be automatically put as a member into this host. And lastly, I can map this target to a credential libraries. Here I have a credential library from AWS, from Vault for AWS. And basically that allows Boundary to consult Vault at a specific path to draw the credentials. So other than these targets in the project, I have users, groups, and more importantly, roles. This is where we can give capabilities to users and groups, basically what we call them principals. We can give them, or we can grant them a set of capabilities. In this case, I specify the actions to do everything because I'm an administrator. So that is, in essence, the administrations on the Boundary side, right? As a end user, you normally use a different tool, what we call a Boundary desktop, in order to connect to Boundary. So here, I'm going to be just a regular user. I'm going to log in and using the Boundary desktop, which is provided on Windows, on Linux, as well as Mac OS. I can authenticate to Boundary and present it with the targets that I'm allowed to connect to, as well as the sessions that are related to those targets. And I can do the same thing on my command line. So just authenticate to Boundary first. Right, then upon successful authentication, I can connect to any targets that I have access. So let's do that by issuing a Boundary connect. In this case, I want to SSH into the target that I just created, which is AWS host, and give it a username. So what happened here is the controller, basically the worker asks for permission, the controller gives that permission back, and then draw the credential from the Vault credential library and present that to the user. And notice that the connections that we set before, which is I think 20 or 30 seconds, that takes place, and the connections basically close automatically. But you can also control the sessions from the Boundary desktop. So you can see, well, this is not updated, but you should see the sessions here, and you can basically cancel that sessions from the desktop as well. Okay. Another thing is the this target is dynamic. So if I show you the boundary set, this is the criteria that I'm using, project called demo. So any running EC2 instances with these tag-based rules that matches this criteria will be put into the host sets. And currently I have one host as a member in that set. Let's take a look into do a couple of examples connecting to, say, a database. So now I want to be connected to the ERP project as an analyst. So let me use the Boundary desktop to connect. And notice that the worker again open up a specific port for users to use, as well as the username and the passwords that are drawn dynamically from the Vault credential store. And just get the username and the password. So this is the credentials that's unique for this session, and it will be revoked. It has a it's time bounded. It will be revoked by the time the lease is up. Oh, I think let me edit the connection again. Oh well, I think I have just slightly problem with this this client, so never mind. I will show you another way to connect to the Boundary. I'm going to use a DBA instead, and I'm going back to my CLI. So here, I'm going to use a command line again to connect, and in this case, it's going to be Postgres instead of the previous one. As before, I'm going to use the target name, which is a PSSQL DBA target. This is basically going into the same database, but in this case, I'm going in as a DBA instead of analyst. And also notice that the target name here is a logical name. It's not an IP address, nor it's a DNS name. It's a logical name that we've given earlier in the Boundary. So in this time, the connections basically is quite smooth here. I don't even have to put in the credentials. The Boundary controller inject that to my session. I'm connected as a DBA, And the session, this credential is a just-in-time credential that are drawn from the vault, and it can be cleaned up after I'm done using this. So with that, I'm actually gonna end my demo. This is what I have today for you for Boundary. Basically, I have shown you how to how Boundary can streamline access by using identity-based control. And we talk about dynamic host catalogs, which is a way to discover new targets. And we also describe just-in-time credentials, which is basically a time-based credentials that is unique to the sessions, and it will be revoked when the lease is up. So Boundary is an open source project. You can try it out. You can download it. Let us know when you try it out. And all of this can be done without putting users onto the network. Right? With that, I'm going to end my presentation and demo. Thank you for your attention.